My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. The last two episodes, I've had some amazing guests. Today, I wanted to get back to the old-fashioned way of doing a podcast that is just me talking about something from Chinese literature. Hopefully, I'll have some more guests coming up pretty soon. But we're going to go back to the old ways today. And in today's podcast, we're going to look at something from the Song Dynasty, something that I don't think you ever expected to hear. We're going to examine the greatest fart joke in all of Chinese literature. This is a fart joke between Su Dongpo and a Buddhist monk named Buddha's Stamp. But before we get to all that, really quick update on my book, China's Backstory. I know some of y'all have been asking about it. I've been working really hard, as I mentioned at the year-end episode of 2024. I turned in drafts of the book to my editor, and I thought, wow, that was a lot of work. Now I'm off the hook. I can go skiing a bunch. Nope. Turns out there's still a lot more work to do. No surprises, really. I've been editing those drafts again and again. In fact, for the last 3 or 4 weeks, I just spent every weekday reading and rereading those drafts and getting some comments from some friends. I turned it over to my editors. This is coming out on the last Friday night, Saturday morning of March. About a week before that, I turned in something kind of close to a finalized draft, or it's the final draft before my editors actually sit down and hack that draft to pieces. So they're right now hopefully looking over the book and going through it with a fine-tooth comb. We're looking at a publication date in late September or early October. By the way, if you're interested in signing up to get news of the book, you can navigate over to ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. There's a button right there on that page. You can pre-order my book. You don't actually pre-order it. You're really just giving my editors your email address. One thing people have been asking, if you're interested in doing more for the book, contributing a little bit more to it, my editors at Unsung Voices Books actually asked me to find people who are willing to read an advanced reader copy. That's an ARC. So at some point, probably in the summer of 2025, if you agreed to do this, what we would do is we would send you a version that my editors have looked over. It's not quite the final version, but it's pretty dang close. So we would send you a digital copy of that. The book would be in an almost perfect state. The point of this is all that you read the book and then you give us a blurb that Unsung Voices Books can use on its social media promotion campaign. Again, hopefully you put it out on your social media feed so that other people see that. If you're interested in getting an advanced reader copy and doing that, reading the book and providing your comments on the book, send me an email at ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. Okay, that's enough of my own personal marketing farting. Now let's get down to the main business of this podcast, fart jokes. Today we are going to look at the greatest fart joke in all of Chinese literature. Su Dongpo, one of the greatest poets in all of Chinese literature. He's from the Song Dynasty, just in case you have forgotten. The Song Dynasty goes roughly from 960 to 1279, and we could debate those dates. Su Dongpo himself lived right in the sort of middle of that, 1073 to 1101. Su Dongpo was a poet. We've talked about him before on the podcast in the summer of 2021, way back when Rob and me were doing the podcast together. We actually had a discussion of a couple of Su Dongpo poems. And in December 2023, I actually did a podcast by myself on Su Dongpo's poetry trials. He was actually put on trial in a sort of kangaroo court in the Song Dynasty for some highly political poems that he wrote. He did not get executed, but he was pretty much on trial for the rest of his life. I should hasten to add that Su Dongpo is not just a poet. He was also a powerful politician in the Song Dynasty. He's a Song Dynasty bureaucrat, a very high-level Song Dynasty bureaucrat. There are some economic debates that begin around 1069. These economic debates are hugely important to China's economic history. Su Dongpo comes down on the side of the economic conservatives, and part of the reason that he was punished was just because the partisanship in this period of the Song Dynasty is so brutal. His punishment oftentimes, and this happened repeatedly, his punishment is that he was exiled to the south. The Emperor sent Su Dongpo deeper and deeper into the malarial wilds of China's south. And this actually kind of went back and forth. Su Dongpo was sent down to the south and then brought back into power and then sent down to the south again and again. This happened many times. Another thing I should point out about Su Dongpo is not his given name. He's, I think, more frequently known as Su Dongpo. His last name is Su. His surname is Su. That's his family name, but his given name was not Dongpo. That's a name that he chose for himself. Like most intellectuals in China, he had a bunch of different names depending on the situation he was in. Dongpo is kind of his rap name or his stage name, just as Chris Brian Bridges is not normally called Chris Brian Bridges, except for those who know him closely. His rap name is Ludacris. So Su Dongpo's birth name was Su She, but he chose his rap name of Dongpo, which just means Eastern Slope. He chose that name while he was in exile. He was situated on a farm called Eastern Slope, which you can guess which side of some mountain it was situated on. So Su Dongpo, I'm going to call him Su Dongpo, but keep in mind you might see sources when you're looking him up that say Su She. Both are correct. Today's text, that is the fart joke, occurred when Su Dongpo was working as a politician in the city of Guazhou. That's on the north bank of the Yangtze River. It's just south of modern-day Yangzhou. Yangzhou is, by the way, where fried rice comes from, that particular dish. So if you enjoy fried rice, it's a great place to go. I had some fried rice there. It was phenomenal, obviously. Guazhou is not much of a city today, but back in the day, it was a relatively large port on the Yangtze River. Su Dongpo, while he was there as a politician, ginned up a friendship with a Buddhist in a temple in the city of Zhenjiang. Zhenjiang is just across the Yangtze River on the south bank of the Yangtze River. The monk's name was Zen Master Foyin Liaoyuan. I don't want to kind of get into the politics of naming, but the term we use in English, that is Zen, in China, that's called Chan Buddhism. So the Japanese pronunciation of this exact same word, the exact same word is Zen, but in China, in modern Mandarin, the pronunciation of that word is Chan. And since most Westerners call it Zen, because it was transmitted to areas outside of Asia via Japan kind of got to name the English word for that. They're pretty much the same thing. You know, obviously Japan is going to have its own take once it creates this thing called Zen Buddhism. But when you're looking at the early Zen Buddhist masters, if you go back in a time machine 700, 800, 900 years, none of them would have said, oh, what we're doing is different from what they're doing in China. Japanese nationalists today may say that, but certainly Zen masters of 1,000 years ago would not have ever made that claim. But there is a kind of politics to this, but I'm going to call it Zen just because I'm speaking to an English forward audience. So Zen Master Foyin, that's just Zen Master Buddhist stamp. It's literally what his name means. Most Buddhists, when they became monks, chose new names that were derived from Buddhism. So Zen Master Buddhist stamp is not all that unusual. One thing you need to understand about Buddhism to get this fart joke is that Zen Buddhism has a concept called the 8 winds. These 8 winds are things that can blow you off your course as you're trying to be a good Buddhist and achieve enlightenment. Those 8 things, the 8 winds, are praise, insults, defamation, honor, profits, loss, bitterness, and happiness. I'm not quite sure what the difference between insults and defamation are. Honor and praise also pretty similar. I mean, they're different words in Chinese. When I was doing the research for this podcast, they're clearly different words, but they kind of seem like the same thing to me. They're synonyms, but there you are. There are 8 winds. Those are the 8 winds. If you are influenced by these 8 winds, you are blown off your course to being a good Buddhist. Remember, in Buddhism, the goal of the religion is to recognize that everything in this world is false. This is samsara. Everything is just this endless cycle of birth, death, rebirth. It's all pain, and all of this is an illusion. If you can, using spiritual techniques developed by Gautama Buddha, you can short-circuit this cycle and achieve enlightenment, stepping out of this cycle. That's the goal. So Su Dongpo is over at Guazhou. He's studying Buddhism while he's working as this official in that city. He's hanging out, talking with his friend on the other side of the river, Zen master Buddhist Dam. Su Dongpo comes to believe, as he does his Buddhist studies, he comes to believe that he's made some real advances in terms of his personal moral development. He thinks that he has conquered the temptations that one might get from those 8 winds, and he writes this poem talking about how awesome he is, how much of a Buddhist bad mama jamma he is. Now that he has kind of advanced in his study of Buddhism, he's come to believe that he's a great Buddhist. Here's the poem that he writes. I bow my head to the heaven of heavens, that tiny ray of light that is Buddhism's shining on the vast universe. The 8 winds cannot move me. I sit straight like the purple golden lotus. A couple of things to note about this poem that Su Dongpo writes. He starts out, I wouldn't say he's humble, but at least he's not talking about himself in that first couplet, those first 2 lines. He starts out saying he bows his head. So there's this kind of sign of submission to Buddhism, whatever that entails. The second line, he's talking about how awesome Buddhism is. He's not talking about himself. In that second line, there's this kind of sense that this tiny ray of light, just a single ray, a symbol of Buddhism itself, this tiny ray of light is able to shine all over the vast universe. It's not a humble start to the poem, but he's not flattering himself in any way in this first couplet. But then there's this real shift in the second half of the poem. Line 3, all of that humility is gone. It's out the window. Now Su Dongpo is talking about how awesome he is now that he's such a great Buddhist. He says those 8 winds, the temptations that Buddhism warns its practitioners about, praise, insults, defamation, honor, profits, loss, bitterness, and happiness, those things don't move him anymore. He's just too great of a Buddhist to be moved by that. When reading this, you're like, oh wow, he's super prideful. And line 4 is even more prideful. He essentially compares himself to a purple golden lotus, which is in Chinese Buddhism a symbol of enlightenment. Without actually explicitly saying that, he's saying that he thinks he's pretty close to enlightenment. He's there standing straight like the purple golden lotus. Now he's getting really proud. So, okay, Su Dongpo is super proud of himself. He sends this poem off to his friend, Zen master Buddhist Dam. He's so proud of himself that he's like, let me send this poem across the river to my Zen master friend on the other side of the river. He sends the poem across the river, and pretty quickly his servant comes back. And Su Dongpo goes, well, what did the Zen master say? And his servant goes, he didn't say anything. Su Dongpo goes, well, why'd you come back so fast? And the servant goes, well, because he wrote something on the poem. And Su Dongpo goes, what'd he write? And the servant goes, I don't know. Su Dongpo says, hey, let's open it up. He opens it up, and all over Su Dongpo's poem, the Zen master wrote one word, fart, fang pi. That's it. Su Dongpo is super angry. He goes, why did my friend, this Zen master, write fart on my poem? This is an insult. I've been nice to him before, and he goes and does this. Su Dongpo doesn't wait. He gets in a boat and goes across the Yangtze River. He marches into the temple, and he says to his Zen master friend, hey, what's up with writing fart on my great poem? And the Zen master replies with this famous line, you said the 8 winds cannot move you, but with a single fart, I was able to get you all the way across the Yangtze River. I was able to blow you all the way across the Yangtze River. 大风吹不动，一匹大锅浆. Wham! In one sense, there is this great joke. Here's Su Dongpo talking about how great he is, how great of a Buddhist that he is, how the 8 winds of Buddhism cannot move him. And the Zen master makes a joke about breaking wind. And the joke in English translates pretty well into Chinese, that connection of wind to farts. But there's this larger philosophical and religious message. Su Dongpo gets decent at Buddhism, and he comes to think that he's God's gift to God. He writes this poem that's very highly praising of himself. When the Zen master writes on this vainglorious poem just the word fart, the master was trying to puncture that sense of pride and also simultaneously show Su Dongpo how little he had learned. Remember, one of the 8 winds is insults. Su Dongpo proved that he was moved by one of those 8 winds, even in this poem about how he can't be moved by those 8 winds. I'm going to start to wrap this podcast up. Hopefully this is not the last fart joke of the podcast, because this was actually pretty great. One question that hung over this whole episode as I was doing the research for it: did this really happen in history? I'm sure y'all are wondering that as well. My answer is maybe. So when I was doing research for this podcast, most of the sources that I found on this particular event were from Buddhist text. Now, I didn't go diving into the archives, but I didn't find anything from non-Buddhist sources about Su Dongpo and this fart joke. I reached out to a professor of mine who's an expert on Su Dongpo, and he didn't respond. Maybe because he didn't take this seriously, or maybe there's some other reason. I really do wonder how historical this is, because it's such a perfect Zen Buddhist parable. And it makes me wonder, was it true? Maybe? Maybe not. It's hard to know. Either way, it's a great story. And what I can tell you is that there are lots of Chinese language Buddhist sources that talk about it as if it's true. But I have not been able to find any non-Buddhist sources that talk about it. I'm going to put some of those sources up on the podcast webpage, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. You can go there and find this episode and take a look. If you read Chinese, see what you think. As I often try and do, I'm going to end this podcast with a Chengyu. There aren't too many Chengyu about farts, but I did find one. 果屁不通. This Chengyu literally means dog farts make no sense, and it refers to something that's utterly illogical or absurd. 这篇文章果屁不通，没有逻辑. So this article is nonsensical dog fart. It has no logic. That's how that sentence would literally be translated. I'm going to see if I can use that Chengyu this week. Watching the news, I can think of a lot of things to describe 果屁不通. As usual, if you liked this podcast, if you thought it was completely 果屁不通, whatever, if you were indifferent to this podcast, send me an email. I will get back to you. It takes me a while, particularly if you have the word fart in your subject line. It might take me a little bit longer to cross the Yangtze. My email is ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. If you want to be an advanced reader of the book, send me an email. Like I said, I'll put links up in Chinese to the story. I'll also post my translations of the poem that Su Dongpo wrote, so you can take a look at that on the website. Okay, that's enough for me. I'm going to go fang pi, go do some farting. My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.